Okay, welcome to Chapter 10, Constructing Observational Studies. And this is a study design that's slightly different than what we've been talking about to date. Last chapter we discussed the development of surveys and the asking of good questions, and you did do that assignment within your discussion board. So Chapter 10 is about a different style of study. This is the observation, and that's exactly as it sounds. Rather than asking questions and getting answers, you observe behaviors, observe interactions, and collect data that way. I'm going to focus in on just a couple of key points for this chapter, so today's presentation will be fairly brief. So the first distinction that you can make about observational studies is whether or not they're structured or unstructured. And structured would be situations that are designed by the researcher. So if this occurred in a lab where you'd set the conditions or the researcher would set the conditions. And this is usually based on a hypothesis, so they're deductive and more frequently quantitative in nature. So as you can imagine, it requires behaviors to be specifically defined. And they need to be consistently measured. And there's this concept of inter-rater reliability. And I just want to touch on inter-rater reliability for a minute. What does this mean? It means that if you and I are sitting down watching, say, a argument between parents, and we observe name calling, that we independently would check and identify name calling at the same point. Or if we observed maybe the silent treatment, that we would both see and notice the silent treatment at the same point and define it as the same thing, so that whether or not you were doing the observation or I was doing the observation, the data would be consistent to a particular percentage. And so this is called inter-rater reliability, meaning it doesn't matter who the rater is. If everybody's trained and agrees on the definitions, then the data will be good because it will be consistent between raters. So our interpretations of the situation wouldn't be different. So on the other hand, you have unstructured observational studies, and these most often occur in the natural environment. You might be familiar if you think about ethnographies or anthropology, very frequent users of the unstructured observation, where you go out into the environment, you take notes on what you see, and you may become a participant. And that's a really interesting element of unstructured, environmentally based surveys, is that you can't interact in that situation from behind the two-way wall. So in a lot of situations, you also will have interactions with your participants, and that is something that needs to be considered as part of the influence of the research. So just a couple of things about ethical issues with relationship to observation. Informed consent is something that still is required for participants. And this is an area that's really interesting. Well, a big discussion right now has to do with essentially observation on the internet. So for example, if members of internet chat board are posting conversations, can a researcher go in and observe those conversations? And do they need informed consent because they're happening in a public environment? And conservative research ethicists would say yes, you would need participant from a group before you did that kind of observation. And same thing if you're observing in a school environment. It gets a little bit more difficult when you're talking about a very public place where you're observing, say, for example, in the video that's posted, cars at a stoplight. Probably you don't need to obtain informed consent at that point. But if there's any idea or thought that the participant may be at risk for having their personal rights violated, then you would want to create an observation situation where you had informed consent. So in any research design, especially as a social worker, considerations for diversity and social justice are really important. So, you know, one of the things, again, when you think about your observations of a situation, understanding the culture that you're observing, really gathering information and making sure that you're not perceiving things in a biased or culturally oriented way, your culture versus the culture of the people that you're observing, so that you can also understand behaviors, because cultures are embedded in behaviors, and if you don't understand them, it can be difficult, onerous to interpret what they mean and to not place values or beliefs on those behaviors that you don't understand.